Good afternoon, everyone. This is Harry Haney, and I'm responsible for the Supply and Value Chain Center here at Loyola University Chicago. And I want to welcome you today and thank you today for being on this webinar. This group, the Women Business Leaders, was relaunched about a year ago, and the goal has been to provide a forum for women women at all stages of their career to help with their advancement and professional development. We cover a variety of topics. This is our third webinar. The first two were on financial planning and work-life balance. So it's not just supply chain topics. And in the future, if we're always looking for good speakers and good topics, so if you have ideas, please let us know about that. I also want to thank and recognize Sue Eaglebarger, who is Vice President of Lawson Products, who has led this group for the last year, and she's done a terrific job. And Ryan Sinnen, who's part of our team here at Loyola, that's helped with the marketing and with the technical support here today. So without any further delay, I'd like to turn it over to Sue to kick us off. Sue?
Harry, thank you so much, and welcome everyone. We're so excited you could join us today. We have a great topic, women in boards of directors. So before we jump into it, I want to share just a little bit of information about our presenters, both of whom are going to share their personal experiences as directors of boards. So first, as you know from his bio, we're going to hear from Neil Jenkins, who not only has an accomplished career as General Counsel, but also 40 years of experience sitting on different types of boards, non-for-profit, educational, private, and public. Neil's going to share some information with us about the general landscape of board membership today, as well as ideas on how to obtain a seat on a board. Then we're going to turn it over to Liz Levy-Navarro, who again, from her bio, you know, has had tremendous success both as an executive in finance, as a founder of her own company, and as a director as well on several different types of boards. And she's going to share with us really her personal journey on how she obtained board seats. Once Neil and Liz are done speaking, we'll open it up for questions. You probably realize by now that when you logged into the webinar, you are defaulted to mute. When we get to the Q&A session, we'll simply ask that if you have a question, just unmute yourself and shout it out. And if we have, you know, a barrage of questions, we'll certainly we'll moderate that as best we can. If you prefer to type your question versus unmuting yourself, you can do so by simply typing it into the message bar, which is in a box up on your screen. So with that, I'm very pleased to start the presentation by turning it over to Neil Jenkins.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. We're going to start the presentation on women in boards with a couple of slides which come from a recent edition of the Corporate Board Member magazine. Ryan, if you would display the first two slides, take a moment to consider the statistics on this slide and the next one, if you would, Ryan. And from these, you will see that there certainly is no shortage of qualified women to serve on boards. As you will note on slide 2, though, approximately 20% of board seats in public companies are held by women. So the question you ask is, why are there so few women on all of these boards? Well, I think historically it's no secret that boards have been held by older white males. And it's been a good old boys club or friends of friends club, whatever you want to call it. And there's a conscious bias against women with respect to boards of directors. That is changing, fortunately, but it's there. There's also something called implicit bias, which is an unconscious bias element. And there have been studies. I recently attended a program for corporate lawyers where there was a speaker discussing implicit bias. And she gave examples of a symphony orchestra where there were something like 42% of the applicants were women for new positions, but only 7% of those selected were women. So they did a study with this, and they conducted a blind test where the reviewers could not see the musicians playing for, trying out for the symphony. And when they did this, 50% of the candidates selected turned out to be women. The judges were surprised at themselves and did not realize that they had this unconscious bias. There was another example of baseball umpires who they conducted a study of baseball umpires, and they concluded that in instances where pitches were close to the strike zone, the umpires would, in many instances, favor the pitcher if they were of the same race. If they were not of the same race, they would favor the batter. Again, another example of unconscious bias. When the umpires were told about this and told that a camera would be on them to check them, all of a sudden they became very efficient. So the conclusion was that, yes, unconscious bias can be corrected, but it takes a lot of work. So those are just two of the obstacles which many of you are facing when looking at this board of directors issue. Continuing on with my outline, Ryan, the question is, why does diversity matter in boards of directors in the boardroom? Well, a number of things. It brings diverse perspectives into the boardroom. It improves financial performance. Studies of Fortune 500 companies ranked by the number of women on their boards revealed that those companies in the highest quartile realized a 42% greater return on sales and a 53% higher return on equity. A recent Moody's Investors Service report found that companies with the most gender-diverse boards have the highest credit ratings. Diverse boards mirror customer and client bases. What I mean by that is, when you look at the general population, women currently earn 59% of bachelor's degrees, over 62% of master's degrees, and 53% of advanced degrees, such as PhDs, medical degrees, and law degrees in the United States. That's a pretty astounding statistic. Diversity broadens the talent pool for organizations and gives a voice to new ideas and perspectives. Further, boardroom diversity will flow down and lead to more opportunities in senior management, middle management, and throughout organizations for women, as well as minorities heretofore held down by the culture of our business world. Now, the good news is things are changing. This past September 12th, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal that reported that 42% of new company directors appointed in the second quarter of 2019 were women. That's quite a change. In California, a new law was recently adopted that requires all publicly traded corporations with headquarters in the state of California to have at least one woman on their boards by the end of 2019 or face substantial fines. The state of Illinois recently considered similar legislation, but ultimately it was not adopted. Undoubtedly, though, many states will follow suit and you'll see this becoming more and more prevalent. Big investors, like some stock funds, have also figured this out, that more women in the boardroom lead to higher shareholder returns, and they are also pressing for change. So, with that said, as background, what does it mean to be a director? We can go to the next slide. In public corporations, the primary responsibility of a board of directors is to protect the shareholder assets and ensure that they receive a return on their investment. I'm going to talk mostly today about public corporations because that's where I've hung my hat for the last many years. Directors in public corporations have a fiduciary duty to act in the best interests of the shareholders. While today you hear a lot of debate about social responsibility, sensitivity to the environment, good governance, the mantra in public companies still today is act in the best interests of the shareholders. As a side note, you should also realize that directors have personal liability for their actions. Therefore, it is important to make sure that any board you join has adequate directors and officers insurance and that you are indemnified for your actions. While suits against directors for personal liability almost never succeed, this is an important issue to keep in mind before considering a board seat. If you really want to see a scary story about boards, watch the HBO special on Elizabeth Holmes and the company Theranos. That board had such prominent directors as George Shultz, former Secretary of State, and Henry Kissinger, the smartest man in America, and they still fell for a complete fraud. My own worst experience occurred when I was asked by a friend to join the board of a small startup company. I flew to Las Vegas for my first meeting. When I got to the meeting, I noticed that the first agenda item was an address by bankruptcy counsel. When I asked about this, I was told the company was having some financial issues. I politely asked to withdraw my nomination and went to the airport. This is a good example of why due diligence is so important. Now, in private companies, you also need to know all aspects of how the organization is governed and ensure that you're indemnified and not ever held personally responsible for your good faith acts as a director. The number of directors on boards varies from small boards of anywhere from 4 or 5 to large boards of up to 20 directors. In the past, in public corporations, many boards were staggered, with 1/3 of the directors being elected each year for 3-year terms. This structure was designed as an anti-takeover defense. In today's world of shareholder activism and more transparency, many public companies have moved to electing the entire board each year for 1-year terms. Boards generally meet 4 to 6 times per year, with some boards even meeting monthly. And much of the board work is accomplished through committees, including the audit committee, the compensation committee, and the nominating committee. If you are asked to serve on a board, you will also undoubtedly be asked to serve on at least one committee. It is also important to ascertain how much of a time commitment will be expected of you before accepting a board seat. You should also clear it in advance with your employer so as to avoid any employment issues or potential conflicts of interest. Now, many boards require directors to own stock in the company, so be sure to determine whether or not you have any kind of financial commitment before you join. In public companies, Board fees are taxed as ordinary income, and companies don't withhold the income because you're not an employee. So you need to work with your tax advisor to make sure that you comply with IRS requirements with regard to withholding and so forth. Accepting a board seat is very serious business. So spend at least as much time considering all the issues before accepting as a position as you spend planning your next vacation. So now that you know where all the landmines are, if you still want to be on the board, I'm going to talk and Liz will follow up with how to go about doing that. And we can advance this outline, Ryan, if you would. I think you all know that the chances of Apple Computer, Starbucks, or McDonald's calling to offer you a board seat are fairly remote. I can tell you with certainty this will not happen. These boards are reserved for CEOs or CFOs of major companies, retired government officials, and the like. So what can you do to get on a board? One word answer: volunteer. The best way to start a board career is to join the board of a nonprofit organization. It may be a local charity, a school board, a sports organization, or the like. I have served on charity boards, a school board, and both public and private company boards, and as a corporate secretary to a number of public boards over the past 40 years. Every experience was unique, and I learned new skills and met new people each and every time. I joined a new not-for-profit board this week, and I'm happy to report that there were more women in the room than men at my first board meeting. By volunteering, you will see what it is like to be inside a boardroom. Oftentimes, you will see best practices, sometimes not so best practices, but you will learn either way. I would also add that oftentimes these boards expect a donation. So before you go on the board, find out what you're getting yourself into on a financial basis. We all have different skills, likes, and dislikes. Target an organization where you can bring value to the board and one for which you have some interest or passion. My experience is that life is too short for resume building by joining boards. Don't do it unless you really mean it. If you have a passion you have never pursued in your employment career, look for an opportunity to pursue it through board service. Networking is also critically important. Let people know you are willing and able to serve on a board, and don't be shy about saying why you think you can add value. Prepare that short elevator speech in advance so that when the opportunity presents itself, you'll be ready. As you gain more experience and develop a boardroom presence, the opportunities will come. There are job boards and search firms dedicated to filling board seats as well. But in my opinion, networking with other board members is still the most effective way to find a position. With that, I wish you all well in your journey, and I will stay on for questions after Liz's presentation. Thank you.
Neil, thank you very much. And Liz, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Sue, for inviting me to attend this webinar. And I enjoyed listening to Neil's very thoughtful background. What I would like to do for the attendees is talk about myself in a way as a live success story. So for me, 4 years ago, I made a decision to start to transition from being an executive for a mid-sized management consulting firm and to go on to boards. And I was in a uniquely poor position in not having any real executive contacts in Chicago. All my clients were across the country. I had not been at the time really on a nonprofit board, and so didn't know much about board service. And so I was really at starting position zero. But I knew that it was something that I was really interested in, and I learned a lot about it and pursued it quite thoroughly. So I thought I would just briefly share my personal journey and some learnings that I might suggest to you if it's something that might be of value to you to pursue sometime in the future. The first 6 months I spent speaking to a number of executive recruiters and learning more about really what type of board should I pursue based on my experiences, my background, and my skills. So as Neil had said, so I serve on 4 boards today. I serve on 1 public board and 3 private company boards. Of the 3 private company boards, one's a fiduciary board, which has a different role for the director than advisory boards, and 2 advisory boards, with one of them turning right now in transition to a fiduciary board. So I really am in the potpourri of board governance. So when I started, I did a couple things. I spoke to a lot of folks more informationally to find out a couple things. Why would my profile be of value on a board, and what type of board is most going to value my background? So as Neil had said earlier, I recognized that I was not going to pursue successfully being on the McDonald's board or the Amazon board. So for me, it was really a matter of, if I'm pursuing a private board or perhaps a smaller public board, what type should I pursue and why? Why me? I learned a few things that executive recruiters shared with me that I thought might augment Neil's comments. One is about half of board members in private boards, as well as at least in small company boards, tend to be C-suite executives. Now, by C-suite executives, we're not talking about C-suite of big companies. If you're talking about private company boards and smaller public boards and smaller private company boards, it can be of smaller companies where you're a C-suite executive. But in general, a lot of boards are looking for folks that have really done it, have been out there as an operator, managing businesses at a C-suite level in various different functions. So that's like half of the board positions. The other quarter tends to be folks that are going to be able to be a financial expert on a board. So certainly all fiduciary boards and some advisory boards are always going to seek having a financial expert, and that person has the additional role of being responsible for speaking from the board's perspective in terms of investigating, ensuring that there's good financial oversight for the company. So with that in mind, CFOs, accounting firm type partners tend to be about a quarter of the boards. And then that leaves another quarter. So for me, as it turned out, I was a C-suite executive, but my focus was really around growing companies, value creation. And so that tended to be a little bit in that other category of the fourth. So I stepped back. I did what Neil had talked about. I joined a couple of nonprofit boards, a fiduciary board at Merit School of Music, where it allowed me to get on the finance committee, which was very helpful in giving me some very concrete governance experience in the financial committee, audit committee type of space, which was very helpful. As well as getting on the North Central College Board. And that was helpful too in terms of being able to, that was an advisory board, but gave me more governance. But the key to that is it gives you a lot of also understanding the vernacular and the role of being on a board, which just makes you able to talk about it more and sort of makes you part of the community, which is helpful. So anyway, at the end of the 6 months, what did I come up with? I learned what type of boards I was going to pursue. I understood why was I valuable and could contribute effectively on these boards relative to many other candidates out there. And I had a good idea of where were board members of these types of boards such that I could join those organizations. So a couple of things I might suggest is if you decide that a private board might be of interest, there is an association called the Private Directors Association in Chicago, and that may be one that you would find valuable. They tend to have about 60% of their members are already board members. So it's a great place to meet other board members and start that networking process. If you have an interest in perhaps smaller public boards or private boards, but more public, there's also the NACD, or the National Association of Corporate Directors. And that's also a good association here in Chicago that you can join. But again, it tends to give you more of a public educational perspective on boards. So another thing I did at the end of the 6 months is I had that elevator speech that Neil talked about that's so important. I had revisited my LinkedIn profile to make it more board friendly, because inevitably when someone's looking at your candidacy, you submit your board resume to someone and they have an interest in you. The first thing people do is they'll go to LinkedIn. They do want to see your photo, back to inferred bias. Perhaps that's an issue, but people will tend to want to do that. And then, of course, you have to do a board resume, which is different than a normal executive resume that you probably have today. And often you'll want to make sure you have a good professional headshot, whether you do it professionally or you have someone take it for you. You want to make sure it's something that's professional and looks board appropriate. So in general, I would say how you position yourself in your professional career is not the same as how you position yourself for boards. So that's something just to keep in mind as you do that. So at the end of the 6 months, I stepped back with all this knowledge, but still not in any boards. So at that point, probably a couple months before, I started to do, as Neil talked about, the aggressive and networking. So I joined those associations that I talked about. I joined a social club downtown, a professional social club as well. And I just did a lot of informational interviews. And the key is, my suggestion is, of course, you always want to let your network know that you're looking for board opportunities and perhaps what type of board opportunities. But also you always want to ask them, who else that they might know that's on a board that you could talk to. And I always find when you do network, you want to network so you're asking them something that they can do for you that is not a burden. So you're not going to ask them to get on their board if you're just meeting them, because that's going to be an overreach in terms of an ask. But a more practical request would be, hey, I would love to hear about your board journey, how you got on a board, and any suggestions or advice you might have for me as I start my journey. That tends to be a very welcoming and opening way to start the networking process, and I found that really effective. As important as it is to talk to actual people on boards, I also found very fruitful, and one of the boards I ended up getting on was through this avenue, which is attorneys who serve boards. And a lot of times they are a good source that boards turn to for potential candidates. So be open to those type of networking opportunities in addition to those that are on boards is something I might suggest to you. And then the last couple things, and then I'll just open it for questions, is, what you'll find is once you, it takes time. So you can't get discouraged. I guess what I would say is in my business, I started, co-founded, and then ran a management consulting firm focused on growth issues for 15 years. So I did a lot of new business, which meant a lot of networking, identifying needs, and closing business. So the concept of selling was a natural one for me. But even with that, it took me over a year to get on my first board. So even if you find that you're going through a few months and you're having these great informational conversations, but you're not getting, opportunities right away, don't get discouraged. It often takes the need to tell a bunch of people. Think of contacting all your network and then having them lead you to other friends and family they know that might be in the board space. Think of contacting at least 100 folks over, a year and a half, as you lunch or have a drink after work or have a coffee before something pops up, and don't feel like you're not on the right path, but, recognize that it just takes time. And I have to say that, once you get on your first board, it becomes much easier to get on your second board. So the hardest thing is that first board just gives you that credibility. And you're able then to demonstrate and say, hey, I am now a board member. I am on the governance committee or on the audit committee, and it makes things easier. So the difficult thing is just to stick to it for that first year or a year and a half as you're getting on that first board. And I guess I'll stop there.
Liz, thank you so much. So to the group listening, I would encourage you to either type in a question or a comment, or certainly just go ahead and unmute yourself and shout it out. So I'll give everyone a minute to think if they have a question or a comment, but out there, actually, maybe to both Liz and Neil, what would you say, was there one key thing that you feel that you did? We heard a kind of a laundry list of a variety of things to do to get on your first board. Is there one of those that you would rate as the most important thing to market yourself or to get into the board, get referred for a board?
Work home. Mm-hmm. There's not really time.
Sorry, there was a little bit of back noise. What was your question again, Sue?
You know what, Liz, maybe I'll pause here for a moment. Does someone have a question? Okay, if you don't have a question, I would ask that you go ahead and keep yourself muted.
Yes, that's going to ask you.
So someone out there, if you could press your mute button, it sounds like maybe you're on a phone call. And my question, Liz and Neil, was if you had to rank the #1 best thing that you could do to network or market yourself for board membership, what would it be?
Well, I guess what I will start, and I will say that I think that it is two things. One is I would go ahead and join the Private Directors Association because it is the one that's going to help get you on a lot of private boards. And private boards are probably the easier ones to get on for your first board, unless you are, like I said, could be a financial expert, which I think gives you maybe more ability to get on a public board. And I think the Private Directors Association, right there, you're getting to talk to, a lot of private directors already. And they also have good educational programs that allow you to learn the vernacular and all that. So I would say that. And then secondly, I really think it's important to, once you've packaged yourself and know your value, is to go out and network with not only your own network, of course, but also, seek to have them help you meet other folks that they know that are within the board director space.
I made that.
And Liz, I'll just follow on that. I think that Liz is spot on there, and I think I would add to that you want to make sure you do your homework, do some research so that you have some idea of what happens in a boardroom, what the words mean, and you have to be careful what you wish for here, because if you are asked to be on a board, you don't want to come in and be ill-prepared to understand what's going on. So there's a lot of, there's just a especially in today's world, there's so much information out there. You could spend the next 6 months just reading articles about what it means to be a director and what the words mean and so forth. So do a little independent research so that when you start this journey, you have some feel for what you're getting yourself into.
Great, thank you, Neil. And I'll go ahead. We have a question that was submitted from the audience. And the question is, what is your view on using fee-based firms that help place board members? And I would ask either of you to comment.
Well, and I actually looked into that avenue. There's a whole range of folks that can help you with a whole range of sort of services they provide and fees. And I guess I would ask yourself, you have to ask yourself honestly about if you can do the kind of preparation. A lot of them, what they'll do is they'll help you to create a board resume, and they'll help you with creating the elevator speech, and they're going to help you think about how to identify boards that are best, that you're going to be able to present your capabilities in an attractive way, that they'll find you attractive. So those are all good things. Those are things that you can do, but it takes some investigation and it takes some work to do that. So, and some of them, the fees can range from, $2,000 and up, depending on the services. So, in my opinion, for me, I didn't pursue that route, although I investigated it, because I felt that I could develop my board service resume. I could create my own pitch. I could update my LinkedIn by looking at others. So one nice thing about the Private Directors Association is a free service to members, is that they have a program for new board members, people that want to be board members, where you work with an existing board member who will take you through templates of how to develop a board resume. They'll interview you and give you feedback about your approach, and sort of just give you some good primer on how to pursue boards. So, I might pursue that first. And it kind of depends on how much money you have. If you have a lot of money, you're in a very successful career, then what the heck? Why not spend the money and help yourself have someone that's going to guide you through it? But you don't need to do that to be successful, and I didn't myself.
And I'll just add to that, I don't have a lot of experience with fee-based recruiters, but I did have one experience where I was on the board of a company and our CEO expressed a desire to go on other boards. So we considered hiring a professional firm to place him. And the experience was okay. It was expensive. And I think it's a lot like paying an executive recruiter. Employers will pay an executive recruiter a lot of money to find people. But if an individual goes to an executive recruiter, you kind of get pushed to the back of the line. So I think that a lot of these fee-based firms are more interested in being retained by companies who obviously have deeper pockets and are a sure thing than by some individual who may have a limited budget. So I would agree with Liz. I think there are other ways to do it, and I think networking is probably a much better avenue and will yield the desired result as much as spending money would do.
Right. Oh, and one other thing I would mention is if you're wanting to get on a public board, most public boards will use an executive recruiter, one of the larger, could be tier 1 or tier 2 executive recruiters to help them find those candidates, right? So that becomes a gatekeeper in often, unless for some reason you can network with one of the board members that are on the board or their counsel, and then they can provide that you as a candidate into the pool of candidates. On the private side, a lot of private companies, are owned by families. or certainly they're human beings, right, instead of shareholders, as shareholders, and they'll go through family business centers and to help do this. And so one of them is Loyola's Family Business Center and others. So there may be ways for you to also provide your candidacy into those realms of executive recruiters focused more on family-owned private businesses. That may be another angle that's, I think, easier potentially to be part of the pool that then they consider as board opportunities arise.
Great, thank you. We do have another question that was submitted, and the question is, when looking at board service, are some terms better than others? I was on a board once before that had a 3-year term available and a 6-year term available. I was granted the 6-year term and felt it was too long.
Well, I'll take the first crack at that. I think that in today's world of good governance, terms of 2 to 3 years are much more standard and appropriate. I served on one board that had a 4-year term, and they asked me to serve a second 4-year term, and it felt like a sentence. And when I was able to get off after 6 years, I felt like I got out for good behavior. It can be too long. Now, on the other hand, if you're on a board where the business does something you love, I've seen people stay on boards for 30 years. I think that's a little excessive in today's world. But I think the good governance principles today would advocate a 2 to 3 year term.
And to build on, what Neil said, I think it depends in some ways. Now as a board member, I always advise our boards, if they don't already have it in place, to have 3-year terms, at the most, because I think it's important for the board and the company and shareholders to sort of reassess the current board member to make sure that they're still contributing and they're still involved and engaged. From the board member's perspective, I think it's really about, like Neil said, your personal interest and how engaged you are. You need to be honest with yourself. If you're losing engagement and you're no longer finding it something that's really of interest to you, you're not doing yourself or the board and the company that you represent or nonprofit organization to continue on. So I think a 3-year term is nice because it allows you a natural out that's easy. But I have seen board members sometimes, step down sooner. They might have had a 6-year term and they step down after 4 years, let's say, because they really weren't engaged anymore. And I think as long as they give enough time to the board to be able to find another board member, I think there's nothing wrong with that. So I think it's a matter of personal interest at that point.
Great, thank you. So we have about 15 minutes left. There's no more questions in the queue, so I'll throw out a last call. Are there any other questions or comments that anybody would like to make or ask of Neil or Liz? Feel free to unmute yourself or type something into the message bar, so I'll give it just a couple of seconds here. Okay, here's another one. I understand that many boards are volunteer, but what sort of paid board opportunities are available and how do you find those? Great question.
Well, again, I would say, I don't know of a public company that doesn't pay their directors, and many private boards provide fees for directors for their time. And I think the answer is the same answer we've given earlier today, and Liz can chime in, but in order to get to step 2, you got to get to step 1. So if you're looking purely for a fee-based board seat, as Liz said, it's just going to take you longer to land a seat because you don't have a track record, and unless you have some personal relationship, it's not likely that you'll be quick to find something like that. You know, the larger companies pay very large fees, and there you can read stories about directors who serve on 6 or 7 boards, but that's the exception rather than the rule. So I would go back to Liz's advice and start out slowly and be realistic that it's going to take a while.
And I would say, to build on that, I think, as Neil said earlier, nonprofit boards, the most established and the more prestigious, you will actually not just volunteer and not get paid, but you will be required to pay, because part of being on a board of many established nonprofits is the fact that you're committed to the mission of that nonprofit organization, are willing to financially contribute. So, I was on a board where I needed to contribute $10,000. Some of the largest ones, the top tier ones in Chicago, it could be $25,000. But for most of them, it might be $1,000 or $2,000. And there's many nonprofits that you don't have to pay anything to as well, but they tend to be smaller and ones where you have to invest more in terms of your time and networking and helping them build that mission. So keep that in mind. And then in terms of paid boards, you tend to get more fees the larger the company that you serve on. You tend to get larger board fees on public companies than private companies, but it depends on the size of each. You tend to get paid more on a fiduciary board than an advisory board. So there's a full range of paid service on boards depending on the size of the board, the type of board, and so, but yes, on the 4 boards that I serve on that are for profit, I do receive a board fee.
Thank you. So from what I'm hearing from both of you is you can aspire to a paid board seat, but the best way to get there is typically through an unpaid seat for a non-for-profit to establish yourself.
Yes, and I think that should be done in parallel with learning and networking, in tandem, about how you're going to pursue the board path.
Great. Okay, we have now about 12 minutes left. Did someone have a question?
So there's a question on the board.
There it is, yes. It says, I'm a D&I professional looking to diversify our board. How do I find diverse candidates, race, disability, LGBT, veteran, gender, etc., specifically in Chicago in the near the western burbs?
I can answer part of that. So, for example, I am also, in addition to being on the couple of board associations I mentioned, I'm also on the Women's Corporate Directors Board, for example, and they specifically look to match up companies that are looking for women candidates with qualified women candidates that meet their profile. So there is the Women Directors Association. There's also the Private Directors Association, or the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors, are happy to provide specific diverse candidate board searches and help you provide those searches out through their organization to invite diverse candidates to interview and to be considered. So there are actually quite a few avenues for doing that. I also think it's an opportunity of participating on board associations particular or interact with them that are within the type of diversity you're looking for.
Okay, great. Thank you, Liz. Other questions? We did go ahead and mute the call since there was a little bit of background noise, but it seems as though everyone's typing their questions in anyway, so please feel free to put a question in the message bar. Will slides be available post-call? Sure, yes, they will be available. I'm not sure how. I'll work with Ryan on that. I'm sure he has a plan. But yes, we will make the slides available. And as a reminder, this session is being recorded as well. Oh, we can email them out, Ryan says. So we will do that. Other questions? Okay, it looks like something, nope, no more questions. Well, thank you so much, Neil and Liz, for sharing your expertise and your personal journeys, and thanks to everyone who joined our call today. Again, as a reminder, the call is being recorded. In addition, we will email out the slides to everyone on the attendee list. And finally, I again will echo Harry. If any of you have ideas for a future topic or a future speaker for this group, please feel free to reach out to me. And with that, again, Liz, I thank you. Neil, thank you. And have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, Sue. Bye-bye.
Thank you.